Hi, everybody. Really happy to see all of you here today. My name is Denise Pinard, and I'm a volunteer with the UC Master Gardeners of Monterey and Santa Cruz counties. I'd like to welcome you to today's program on vermiculture. Before we get started, let's go ahead and get all of those Zoom issues out of the way, so to speak. So we ask you to keep your microphone muted. Just go ahead and give a double check that that's muted at this point. We also ask you to go ahead and turn your video off. It helps our presentation run more smoothly, and it's a little bit less distracting for everybody. We do recommend that you use speaker view when you're watching. It'll give you a nice big picture of our fabulous slide deck there without so much of the distractions as well. You can use the chat window anytime during the class if you have comments to the group or to an individual. And we also use the chat for our questions. So go ahead and put those questions that you have anytime during the program, and just go ahead and put those in the chat, and we'll take care of all of them and covering all of that at the end of the class. So a couple other things, we've got the live transcript button enabled down at the bottom. So if you'd like to have sort of the closed caption option going as well, you can go ahead and click on that. Any technical questions, go ahead and ask me. You can just chat directly to me, Denise Pinard. And not to worry if you miss anything as we're going along. We're going to send this whole presentation and a link to the video to the email that you signed up for the class within just a couple of days. All right, so for those of you who don't know about the Master Gardeners, a little bit about us here. We are a program staffed by volunteers connected with the University of California. We've been around for over 40 years now. We work in partnership with the Agriculture and Natural Resources Division of UC. We all receive comprehensive training, and our job is to provide outreach and research-based education on horticulture, pest management, and sustainable practices for home gardeners in our local communities. So now that you know a little bit about us, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our instructor for the evening, Bridget. Here you go.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to learn a little bit about vermicomposting. My name is Bridget Matz, and I'm a master gardener and a master composter. I'm also a graduate of the UCSC Farm and Garden Apprenticeship Program. And after that, I stayed on and worked for Orrin Martin in the Chadwick Garden. And I was an assistant manager on that farm. And my main focus in that garden was our composting program. I'm also an avid backpacker and love worms and love to teach. And today we're going to be talking about vermicomposting, aka worm composting. So the definition of vermicomposting is that we will be cultivating worms to eat our food and paper waste and produce the absolute best fertilizer for our plants and gardens. Vermicomposting is neat, it's easy, it's odorless when properly maintained. It's a great way to turn hard to dispose of food waste and some paper waste into an amazing, awesome fertilizer. It can be done indoors, in a garage, on the patio, on the porch, or in any other moderate temperature place that you can think of. It's something that's available for you to do year round, and limited space is okay. And one thing that I like to point out with this slide, if we all were meeting live, I would ask you, what did you really think vermicomposting is? And the answer to that question is vermicomposting is actually just another form of recycling. And it's another way to take responsibility for our own personal consumables. And we are able to close that recycling loop on our own properties in our own homes and avoid sending food waste off to the landfill, which contributes to greenhouse gases. And we have learned over the years, as my former boss, Oren, used to say, food waste in our community systems is one of the #1 contributors to greenhouse gases. So if we can avoid that, then we're doing our own little part at preventing global weirding. Worms for composting depend on where you live and what type of soil you have. There are literally thousands of species of worms that live in the soil. And we find many varieties in our gardens and our compost piles. Only a few of those species are viable for vermicomposting. And what we're looking for really is a worm that lives in the surface layer and is kind of mimicking what we see in our local forests on the forest floor. We're looking for a worm that is a decomposer, that's living in that leaf litter, that is basically decomposing what it might find in nature, fallen leaves and things like that. But when we cultivate them, we're trying to mimic that same environment, but instead of leaf litter and things that they would find in their natural environment, we're giving them our own kitchen waste and possibly paper goods instead. And some of those species that work really well for that are red wigglers and red tigers, blue worms. Blue worms are super cool. They're very much like a red wiggler. They're just this gorgeous turquoise color, but you have to live in a tropical environment for that to be your composting worm. Red worms, red earthworms, and different types of night crawlers. But in our area, the best worm for us to use for vermicomposting purposes is the red wiggler. We have many different species of worms. And in this slide, we're talking about where the worms live primarily. And we kind of went over it a little bit in the last slide, but worms tend to live in 3, different, areas of the earth. One species of worms are considered epigeic, and those are worms like we were just talking about that live in the surface litter. The leaf litter of the earth. And they burrow a little bit, but really kind of spend most of their time up above earth. And that's where they're eating and, spending most of their lives. Then we move into an endogeic type of worm. And that worm is doing a little bit of both. It lives up in the surface and it also has burrows. It might tend to get food from those layers and bring it back down into its burrows. And then we have the anecic type of worm. I have yet to be able to pronounce that word well, so I just spell it out. And that is a burrowing worm that lives deep down in the earth, comes up and kind of drags its food back down into its burrows. So for composting purposes, we're really looking for an epigeic worm that would typically live in the leaf litter part of our earth. And then when we cultivate them, we're going to mimic that in our worm bins. This is just a photo of some common misidentifications. When you're new to vermicomposting and you open your worm bin and you see a ton of these little white worms, sometimes you might be thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, look at that. Those are all my baby worms. And my worms are doing so well. But those are not actually baby worms. Those are something else. They're called a pot worm. They're a very distant relative of a red wiggler. It's always common to see a few of them in your worm bin, but if you see an abundance of them, it might be an indication that something has gone awry in your worm bin. And that could be that the worm bin's gone a little too acidic. Oftentimes it might mean that the worm bin is a little too wet, and maybe that you have overfed the worm bin and your red wigglers are not getting through the food fast enough. So the potworms have arrived, but they are not your baby red wigglers. We're going to talk a little bit about the parts of a worm. The worm is a very complicated creature, and we could go on and on about its anatomy, but one thing to keep in mind is just like when we have pets, birds, dogs, cats, fish, we don't necessarily have every part of their anatomy memorized, but we can still care for them really well and make sure that they have really nice lives. But just a basic run of a red wiggler is they have in the front of their body a mouth, and then behind that they have, excuse me, I'm going to grab my notes here. They have different parts of their body that, here we go, sorry about that, help to digest their food. They've got a pharynx, they have 5 hearts. After that, they have a crop, which is basically where they store their food. And then after that comes a gizzard where they process the food, and they need a little bit of grit for that to happen. And then after that, we have the clitellum, and that is their reproductive parts. And then beyond that is the segments with their intestines that help to process the food that they have digested, obviously. And then it moves through their intestinal system, and then of course comes out as a waste product through the anus as worm compost, or AKA worm poop. As far as the worm's life cycle goes, worms are hermaphrodites, so they do have both male and female parts. And this means that all worms can reproduce and have babies, but it doesn't mean that they can do that by themselves. They still need a friend to reproduce. So when worms are of an adult age and they are ready to reproduce, what will happen is the clitellum will turn a really bright red orange, get a little bit swollen, and it's kind of a signal to any of the other worms that might be around that they're ready to reproduce. And that worm might, kind of crawl on over, and they will attach basically, head to foot, and around the clitellum they will form a mucus layer, and through that, over several hours, exchange sperm, and they'll separate, and that mucus layer, for each individual worm, they will kind of start to wiggle out of, and that will form the cocoon. It will harden, and in about 3 weeks time, from that cocoon will hatch about 5 to 7 individual red worms. And in about 3 months, a worm will be ready to reproduce again. And one really fascinating fact about red worms is that they will not overproduce in their worm bin. So cocoons will not hatch unless the conditions are right. And that means that there's enough food, that there's enough water, that it hasn't been overcrowded, and the temperature is right. And cocoons can last for almost a year. They can get through freezes, they can get through hot spells, and they'll only hatch if they're feeling like it's a good time for them to come into the world. And I find that really fascinating about our little red wigglers. Selecting a worm bin, you have many choices when it comes to selecting a worm bin. In this photo, we have different varieties of commercial type worm bins that you can buy. And they're typically a stacking type of system. And I honestly don't recommend that you buy them. I think the running joke for us master composters is that worms don't have eyes, so they can't read the directions, and they never follow along with what they're supposed to do inside a commercial worm bin. And I think your best bet is actually to make your own. If you already have purchased one of these or you're dead set on making one of them work, then of course I can help you work through any troubleshooting issues that you need. But in the next slide, I'm going to show you the worm bin that I think is the best one that you can make yourself. So these are different types of worm bins that you can make at home. And in the center there, the gray worm bin is my absolute favorite. And that is basically a 5-gallon tub that you can buy at any big box store that we have locally, or preferably maybe you've recently done some spring cleaning, and after you have finished your process, you've got an extra bin around that you can turn into a worm bin. And there's many different ways to use those 5-gallon tubs. You can have a single tub if that's all you need. You can actually create your own stacking system that works better than the ones that you might buy, you know, from Bezos or one of our garden centers. And then in the other photos, we have some people repurposing some recycling bins that they don't need anymore because their systems have changed in their counties and have turned them into worm bins instead. This is a really great photo that shows a little bit more specifics of someone taking a recycling bin that they don't need anymore because, you know, things have changed in the way that they do things in their counties, like I just said. And it's showing that we have some air holes in the bottom and around the top. And they've also attached some feet on the bottom so that it stays up above ground. And not only is that good for air circulation, but also the exudate that comes from worms' natural digestive processes can drain through those holes. And then they've created a really nice lid for it. Any size bin can work, and it really depends on the size of your family and how much vegetarian food waste that you have from your kitchen when you're preparing meals for your family. A good rule of thumb that we've come up with in our program is that 2 square feet of surface area per person, or 1 square foot per pound of waste per week, is kind of a good mathematical way to look at it. We start with a pound of worms, and that's honestly just because that's how they're sold. But you don't necessarily need to purchase worms. If you have any person in your life that is already a vermicomposter, they definitely have worms that they can share with you. And a handful of worms from their bin will get your bin started going nicely. The main point that we are trying to make in this slide is not that you need to keep your worm bin in your kitchen. I'm not quite sure what that photo is about, but if you wanted to, you could. It's that worm bins need to be in a cool place. So they have to be, if they're outside, in a shaded area, in a cool garage, shaded part of your patio. And you have to be mindful that something that might be shaded in the winter isn't necessarily shaded in the summer. And you have to make sure that wherever you keep your worms, that they're in a continuous amount of shade and that temperatures are cool. We're going to talk about worm food here. And a good note is that worms are basically vegans. And if it came from a plant, your worms can eat it. So we're talking about things like vegetable and fruit scraps, banana peels, apple cores, lettuce, potato peels, carrot tops, a little bit amount of pasta, cooked beans, coffee grounds, including the paper filters, tea leaves, tea bags, paper towels, napkins, egg cartons. And then we're making a note of eggshells crushed because that's a really great way to provide your worms with some grit. And when I'm teaching in classrooms, I like to point out to the students that if it was once a plant, your worms can eat it. And so it's not necessarily just your vegetable products, but of course our paper originally comes from a plant. You can even put an old t-shirt in your worm bin, and that's a really fun project to do if you happen to have kids or grandkids at home. A nice old cotton t-shirt that maybe you were going to turn into rags. You can put that in your worm bin, and then the kids can see what happens as the worms process it. And eventually over time, all that's left is the polyester band of that t-shirt. And that's really fun for kids to pull out and see that. And it also helps them make that connection that, oh, right, that cotton t-shirt was once a plant, and that's why my worms can eat it. Things to avoid in the worm bin are mostly animal products, things like meat, bones, fish, dairy, cheese, milk, yogurt. And the reason for that is not necessarily because your worms wouldn't be able to process it, because of course they can process it. It's just that it will make your worm bin pretty smelly, and those smells will attract neighbors to your garden and to your worm bin that you might not want, such as raccoons and wood rats and rats and mice trying to knock over or bust into your worm bin to get that good decomposing material that is smelling so wonderful to them. We avoid pet waste, obviously, because that could lead to different types of diseases that we want to avoid. They can't process oils and plastics. And we always make a note to be careful with breads because it might produce some sort of mold allergies for people that are sensitive to that. We also avoid giving them too many seeds, nuts with hard shells. And that again is not necessarily because they can't process it, but it just takes them a long time to get through it. And they are not fans of acidic or pungent food. So they're not great fans of any type of citrus and or garlic or onions. And I tend to be a lady that doesn't necessarily believe things just because you told me something was true. So I like to test things out for myself. And I decided in my own worm bin to test out the garlic onion theory. And in the center of my worm bin, I put like a garlic clove and some onions and went to check it in a couple days. And sure enough, all my worms were on the side of the worm bin. They were on the lid, and they were letting me know, hey lady, I don't know what you did there, but I am not a fan. As far as citrus goes, if you are having a meal, let's say you're having some fish at night and you're just going to put a little bit of citrus on your fish, your worm bin can handle that. But if you are going to make a pitcher of lemonade or limeade, that's too much for them. And that's better off for your hot compost pile, not your vermicompost bin. Bedding material for your worm bin is really shredded up newspaper. You can use a paper shredder if you want, but honestly, if you get some of our free local papers, you can just find a really sweet spot at the top of it and tear it down in really nice strips and create your own bedding. And there's no need, in my opinion, to go ahead and put that through the shredder. I think just tearing it yourself takes a few minutes and it does the job. We also have shredded cardboard up here. When it comes to cardboard, you do probably want to cut that down. And if your shredder can handle it, go ahead and put it through there just so that you get smaller pieces for the worms. It's easier for them to get through that harder material. And when you're using any sort of magazine or newsprint, or maybe even the envelopes that come, with your bills, you need to make sure that if you're going to shred it, that you remove any sort of like the plastic insert that goes over the addresses on our bill envelopes. Our worms can't process plastic, so that needs to be torn out and put in the different recycling system and just shred the envelope itself. And we have to avoid any sort of like high glossy ads that might come in a magazine, or anything that might have inks that aren't natural, because that's not healthy for your worms. So you just want to make sure that you're not using anything that might have a wax coating or any sort of plastic when you're prepping your paper materials for your worm bin. This is a slide if you happen to live over the hill or maybe in one of our mountain towns where it's easier to get to, that it's a good source of purchasing worms if you need to do that. Also, I've been out and about lately in our areas, and all of our local nurseries have the pound of worms for purchase. Not the case last year when we gave this class, but they're and full stock in all of our local nurseries, whether that be San Lorenzo or Mountain Farm and Feed up in Ben Lomond, or Dig in Aptos. You'll be able to find worms locally. So putting it all together, when we are talking about worms, they're live creatures just like us, and they pretty much need everything that we need. So they need a house, just like we need a house. They need some sort of shelter, and that comes from their bedding, and that is the shredded newspaper or coconut coir, something like that. And in some sort of container, whatever you have chosen to be your worm bin. They need moisture. Worms don't have lungs, so they breathe actually through their skin, and they need to be in a moist environment to be able to do that. Not too moist, more like that really wrung out sponge is the type of moisture level that we're looking for in our worm bins. They obviously need air like we do, and that's why we make sure that they have plenty of air holes when we're putting together our own worm bin if we haven't bought a commercial one. And of course, they need food. They need our food scraps and or our paper waste. Maintaining your worm bin is fairly easy because you're going to be doing that most likely as a weekly or maybe 2-week process. When you take out your food scraps and paper waste to your worms, you're going to walk up to your worm bin and make sure that you still think it's in a nice shady spot and that it's still cool enough for your worms to live. And if not, then you're going to move it to a different location. And then as you go to give them the next batch of food, you're going to make sure that they've already processed the food that you recently gave them. And if not, you're going to hold back a little bit and let them get through that food that you already gave them. If you overfeed them, that's when the worm bin might get a little smelly on you and also attract those critters that we said earlier we didn't want to come check out our worm bins. And if you have some extra, then, if you have chickens or neighbors that have chickens, you might want to give it to the chickens instead that week. Or if you also are doing hot composting along with your vermicomposting, then maybe it goes to the pile instead of the worms that week. And it's a good time to check if your bedding is appropriately moist. And honestly, most worm issues come from worm bin being too moist. So that is rarely your issue, but you want to make sure if we've had a few hot days in a row that it still feels properly moist to you. A side note here, we have what you need to do, let's say, if you're going to go away on vacation. If you're someone like me, my husband and I are avid hikers. We'll sometimes go for really long hikes over the summer. And in that case, I will need to find a worm caregiver, and I will most likely need to take my worm bin to someone like my good friend Denise, who will take care of my worms over the summer. For shorter vacations, you might get away with just giving them some sort of a big feed that you know will hold them over for a couple weeks, like a whole potato, maybe a couple whole apples with some kind of dug out holes in them to make it easier for them to get in and out. But you need to remember that worms are your pets. You're responsible for them, and you have to feed them and take care of them while you're out of town. Harvesting castings. After a while, castings can become toxic to worms and they should be harvested. And it's a little bit subjective of when you think that you want to do this, but a good rule of thumb is whatever size worm bin that you're using, from a 2-gallon worm bin to a 5-gallon worm bin, is once those castings reach about the halfway point of that worm bin, that's probably a good time to harvest your worms. For me, I harvest my worms probably once a season. It's a good reminder, that it's a new season. It's time to harvest my worms. So that means I'm doing it about every 4 months. I know a lot of vermicomposters that do it twice a year. And I know some vermicomposters that do it even more often than I do. But I think the good rule of thumb is once you have castings reaching about the halfway point of whatever container you're using, that's a good time to think about harvesting. And there are many ways to harvest your worm box. It depends on the system that you're using. If you're using one of those tiered systems, then you're obviously taking the oldest layer that you have. It's the oldest compost. It typically has the least amount of worms. And you're going to take that and put that on the top, and then put food on the bottom to get the worms to go down to that bottom layer, hopefully leaving you mostly worm-free compost to use. There are some people that even inside their plastic bins, they put like a little mesh in between there, and they only feed on one half of the worm bin. And when it reaches that halfway point, they feed on the other side of the worm bin, and then the worms go through that mesh into the other side and start feeding on that side of the worm bin, leaving the other one mostly worm-free for your harvesting day. The one that I do is on the bottom right, and I basically do the dump and sort, where I spread out little triangles of piles of worm compost. They hate the sun. They travel down to the bottom of those piles of worm compost, and I can come along and scoop off the top. And for the most part, that's going to be worm-free vermicompost that I can put in a container and use at my leisure for vermicomposting tea or just apply directly to my gardens. There's never going to be a time where you're not going to have to do an extra sift through your harvesting day, because there's always going to be a few worms in the compost that you have harvested, and you want to save those to continue in your new worm bin. So a good way to do that is to look through the compost that you recently harvested, and I found them. Use chopsticks to gently remove them from your piles and then put them back into the bin that you're going to be feeding. So using worm compost is really, sorry, I'm losing my words here, but it's varied, and you can use it in many ways. It's a slow release nitrogen rich fertilizer. You can use it just like you use fish emulsion on bedding plants in your greenhouse, on your plants on your porch, inside your raised beds, directly in your gardens. If you're if you are growing plants directly in the soil, you can spread it around your trees. It can be sifted into lawns. If you make your own soil, you can add it into your own soil. It's also an amazing gift to anybody that gardens, because we gardeners consider it black gold, which is a nice word for worm poop, but black gold sounds better. And when you give it to your garden friends, they look, like you basically gave them a bag of gold, because that's what we think of vermicompost. And it's an amazing ingredient for brewing for compost tea, which is one of my favorite ways to use it. So troubleshooting your worm bin is fairly easy. One of the common complaints that we get from home composters is that there's a lot of fruit flies in their worm bins. And that's a very simple solution. Basically, all you need to do is wet a piece of cardboard or layer a couple pieces of newspaper that's a little bit damp and put that on top of your worm bin, and that will prevent the fruit flies from being able to get into the compost and then planting eggs, and then when you open your bin, getting a face full of fruit flies. Also a good trick is to add some dry layer on top of your vermicompost bin, and that prevents overproduction of fruit flies. Some people like to set the bowl of vinegar in the top of their shredded newspaper in their worm bin. I avoid that just because I'm afraid that I might spill it. One thing that we like to point out is that fruit flies are not a result of your worm bin. They are a result of something that you transferred to your worm bin. So another thing to keep in mind is, as you're collecting things that you're going to put in your worm bin, to make sure that it has a lid. One of those nice kitchen compost bins that you keep on your countertop as you're preparing your food at night for dinner. Go ahead and put it in there and keep the lid on it, and that will reduce the fruit fly situation. On the other side, we have some things that have gone horribly wrong, like when your worms die. One of the common causes of worms dying is that they got too warm. And that's probably because someone put them maybe behind the garage or behind the shed and they forgot about them, and the weather changed, and what used to be a shady spot is now the sunniest spot in the yard, and basically they got cooked in their worm bin. If you have an emergency, we have one of those weird, series of hot days out of nowhere that we get sometimes. A nice way to cool down your worm bin is to add some ice cubes into the vermicompost. That's a really great trick. And Another reason that your worms might die is because the bedding material has become too dry. And that's often, again, because they're in too much of a hot, sunny place. And sadly, one thing that we hear from time to time is people just forgetting that they have worms and not feeding them, and forgetting to feed them leads obviously to their demise. So you need to think of your worms as your pets and make sure that you're caring for them properly. So if we were having an in-person class, we would be doing a little bit of hands-on action right now, which we can't do obviously completely online, but I can at least do a little bit of show and tell. So we're going to go ahead and build a worm bin, and I'm going to take out some little tools here. So I have chosen this worm bin just to be a little good demo for you, because it's something that I can fit on camera. But honestly, this is a really great size worm bin for 1 or 2 people at home that, you know, have a normal amount of vegetables per week. This would be a really good size that you could keep under your kitchen counter and have a really nice worm bin. So you're going to pick out whatever size that you think works for you. And hopefully you found something in your shed or your garage, and or maybe a neighbor has a bin that they haven't used before, because obviously we are trying to recycle, and it's best if we're not buying new products, if at all possible. The main thing that you need to keep in mind when you're establishing your worm bin is that you have drain holes and air holes. So you're going to come through with your handy dandy drill, and you're going to drill several drain holes at the bottom of your worm bin that also are air holes. And then you're going to come around the top and drill several air holes in the top. That is one of the most important steps. And after that, and you're feeling good that you've got enough drainage holes and air holes in your worm bin, you're going to shred newspaper. Like I said, through that like top-down technique that is easy to do, and you'll have enough newspaper in a matter of minutes. And you're going to come through with a water bottle and spray your newspaper and get it adequately wet, not with a hose, not by dumping a bunch of water in there, because once again, we really just want that consistency of that dry, damp sponge. When you're really squeezing it, you're not getting any water coming out of it, but it's still damp. And that's what you want from your shredded newspaper or coconut core, that it's damp, but not dripping. And then you've got a nice little bedding habitat for your worms to be welcomed into. And then you've either got worms from your local nursery, or maybe someone could share some of theirs with you. So we've got some nice little wormies that are gonna go into our worm bin. And honestly, that's it for quite some time. A few weeks, the worms are just going to be processing their bedding material, and you won't need to feed them for honestly about 3 to 4 weeks. And when it comes time to feed them, then we're of course going to give them any sort of vegetable matter, because our worms are vegans. They love coffee filters, and the coffee inside the coffee filter provides a nice amount of grit for them, for their crop to process the food. And tea bags that don't have staples in them can just go right in, because the paper was once a plant, the tea bag's a plant, the cotton was once a plant. They can process that whole tea bag. And look, I just had a little bit of limeade, so this one lime can go into my worm bin, and we're gonna let them get through that for a week and see how they do. And if we need to give them more food in a week, or if we feel better, maybe we should give it a couple weeks before we give them some more food. My worm bins are outside, and I keep them on blocks of 2x4 so that they get good air circulation and that they can drain well. If you're going to keep your worm bins inside your kitchen, as we saw in that photo, and or your garage or on your patio, then you'll want a second bin to put the one that has the drilled holes inside of. You're not going to drill any holes in the second bin. And in that second bin, you're going to put either wooden blocks or bricks. This is just a stone that's a great, size and height. And I'm going to go ahead and put my bin in there. And that'll mean that all the exudate can drain from these holes into this bottom bin, but that's not going to get on the floor of my patio or my garage or inside my house. And then when need be, I'll just take that bin out and drain it around my trees or something. Another thing I like to point out about when you're picking out your worm bins is that I always choose bins that have locking tops. Because that means when the raccoons come for a visit or the rats come for a visit, and sometimes even the squirrels, they cannot get this open, and my worm bin is safe from those neighbors coming in to check out what's going on in my worm bin. And then I have some visuals. I like to show off my fancy knife because I'm a cook, but this is just a reminder that when you're processing food for your worms, they do not have teeth, so they're not going to come along and actually take a bite out of whatever kitchen waste that you're providing for them. They actually need the food to already starting to be decomposing, and their mouths are almost like an elephant trunk, and they kind of come along that decomposing material and suck it up into their digestive system. So the smaller, the better, because that just starts the decomposing process earlier for them. And if you're going to do anything directly from your garden, of course, you want to use your pruners in the same fashion as you do your kitchen knife to get things nice, small, and bruised for them and start that decomposing process earlier for them. Another thing that I like to point out is our eggshells. And as we were talking earlier, worms need some grit to process the food in their crop. And what we're mimicking here with eggshells is maybe some sand that they might find in nature. Coffee grounds are good, vermilite is good, perlite is good, but what vermiculite is good, like to do is I just collect all of our eggshells over the course of a month. And at the end of that month, I grind it in my blender, and I keep half for my tomatoes and half for my worms. And about once a month, I give them a light dusting of eggshells, and I know that that's going to help them process the food that they're eating, that I'm providing for them in the worm bin. This is an example of, we'll pretend it's a piece of cardboard, or that it's layered newspaper and or a paper bag that you got from the store recently. Last year we weren't allowed to bring our own bags in, so you still might have some of these around. You can wet this and put this on the top of your worm bin, and that will keep the fruit flies at bay, and also make sure that your worms are cool and that the moisture level is not evaporating and staying nice and cool for them. Vermicompost looks like really amazing, rich soil. And if we were in class, I would pass it around. And it also smells like amazing, rich soil. And that's what it helps you achieve. And with my vermicompost, my favorite way to use it is to make composting tea. And I do that fairly simply. I just have a 5-gallon bucket that I bought from one of our local big box stores. And I take a couple handfuls of my vermicompost and throw it into my 5-gallon bucket. And I add about a tablespoon of molasses, because that just helps get the microbiology kind of cooking and everybody happy. And because I'm a fancy pants, I also bought a bubbler from a pet store, and I put the bubbler in there. And in about 24 hours, I have vermicompost that I can use on my plants. My favorite way to use it is through a foliar feeding system, something like this. And if you are going to use this, then you do need to make sure you strain it. And I got these amazing paint strainers from my friend Delise, who's helping run the class. And I will strain that into a different bucket before I put it in this, so I don't get any clogging issues. If you're going to be feeding plants without that system, and you just want to directly feed from your composting tea, you can literally just dip any sort of watering system that you like through this, and you can feed your baby plants, you can feed your porch plants just directly by dipping and feeding, whether you are going to take it out into plants that are in the ground, or like I said, baby plants that you've recently transplanted, or your porch plants. So now we have gone through the slides, and we've done show and tell, and this is the time that if you have any questions, I would love to answer them.
All right, we have actually a lot of really good questions today. So, all right, so we'll just start with the ones that came in earliest, I think. What is the fix for those pot worms that you talked about in the very beginning?
So the fix for the pot worms is honestly to make a decision of whether or not you need to harvest. Oftentimes it's a sign that maybe it is time to go ahead and harvest the worm bin because it's gotten a little too acidic. It's often a sign that your worm bin is just too wet. And if it's not time to harvest and you've decided that that is the situation, then all you need to do is add some more carbon to your worm bin. And that is as simple as adding some shredded newspaper, old grocery bags, torn up cardboard into the worm bin to absorb some of that excess moisture and alleviate the situation that way. It's okay to have some of them. You're always going to have some of them in our worm bins. We have a lot of decomposers in our worm bins that aren't just our red wigglers. So when you open your worm bin and you see some other friends inside of there, it's okay. Don't panic. The only thing that I will take out of my worm bin is I will take soldier larvae fly out of my worm bin. I will also take earthworms that somehow find their way into my worm bins out just because they're competing for the food sources that I'm providing my composting worms, and I'll just put them in a nice place in the soil. I've opened my worm bins and found some happy banana slugs in my worm bins sometimes, and I'll just take them out and move them to a different part of my garden. But as far as the pot worms go, it's not something that will hurt your worm bin or prevent some nice compost being prepared for you. It's just that if you get a ton of them, it's a big sign to you, excuse me, that it's time probably to harvest and check how much moisture is going on in the worm bin.
Okay. All right. So you've mentioned adding a small amount of grit. How much is that small amount?
Well, as in many answers to gardening questions, it's one of those, it depends. So it really depends on how big your worm bin is and how many worms that you have. But I would take my eggshells that I've ground up and I give it a really good dusting on top of the worm bin where I see like a nice layer of eggshells. I can see the color of it against the brown. And then I'll take my hands and mix that in to the actual vermicompost itself so that I know that everybody's got access to it. And if you have a smaller worm bin, you'll need a smaller dusting. You really, it would be hard to give them way too much, so I don't think that you need to be too concerned with that. It's more that they need some sort of grit to be processing the food scraps and the paper waste that you're giving them. And the coffee grounds help a little bit, but the crushed up eggshells are really great for them. And I just make sure that I give them something at least once a month.
Okay. So speaking of those, do you wash and dry the eggshells before you process them to put in the bin?
I do not. I know of some people that do, and I know of some people that go the extra step of actually putting their eggshells in the oven. And I don't do that. I just put my used eggshells into a bowl, and once a month I put them through my blender. And like I said, they go into 2 bags. One's for tomatoes and one's for worms. And I make sure my worms get some of those eggshells at least once a month.
Okay. All right. So one of our participants is concerned because their cool spot might be prone to earwigs, roly-polies, some other little critters who might crawl up in through those holes in the bottom. Is that a concern?
It's not a concern. As I was saying earlier, there's a lot of decomposers that you're going to meet in your worm bin, and they're doing their job too. It's okay. But if you do find that you're opening your worm bin and you just feel like, okay, that's way too many uninvited guests to the party, you can go the extra step and go ahead and put a little screen material over the holes that you have drilled. Go ahead and glue a little bit of screen material over those air holes, and that will prevent too many friends coming to the vermicomposting party. I have never done that. I feel really good about where my worm bins are, and I just haven't been bothered too much by an excess of roly-polies or slugs or ants or soldier fly larvae, anything that I might like find in my worm bin that I want to make sure is in balance and not outnumbering my worms by too much. But I do know folks that really only want to see red wigglers when they open the lid to their worm bin, and so they go the extra mile and put the screens over their air holes, and that helps a lot.
Okay. All right. Is there sort of a ratio or proportion that you can suggest for bedding material to food scraps? Is there, I guess, about a little bit more about how much to feed your worms, I think?
Well, the bedding material will really only be in the very beginning. So you're only using that bedding material when you're establishing a new worm bin. And I typically tend to put that bedding material about a quarter to a halfway up my new worm bin. And once the worms have processed most of that newspaper or coconut core or cardboard, whatever I have used to start their bedding material, that's when I start adding food. And how you'll know about whether or not you're adding too much food or not enough food is your weekly checks. So when you take out your kitchen scraps for the week, if you open the bin and you can see visible food scraps from the previous week and they haven't gone through it, then you're overfeeding. And then that particular batch of food scraps needs to go to the chickens or your other compost pile, or wait another week to be added to the worm bin. So it's one of those kind of wait and see and play with it and feel it out and learn as you go kind of things, and you'll get a feel for it. And when you open your worm bin and you can see that most of the food that you gave them a week ago or 2 weeks ago has been processed, and you're mostly just seeing worm poop in your worm bin, then you know that you have been feeding them properly and it's time to feed them again. Also, a good indication of overfeeding is smells. Worm bins really shouldn't smell. And the only reason that they might smell is because they have too much food in them and they haven't been able to process it quickly enough. So the food's going rancid and smelling a bit. We live in a 300 square foot tiny home, and my worms are in our home half of the year. And they're often under the kitchen table. And when we have friends over for dinner, they would never know that they're eating right next to our worm bin unless we point it out. So a big indicator of overfeeding is smell. And when you open your worm bin, it should smell like good, rich soil does. I hope that helps. Let me know if that's not enough.
All right, we'll wait for a follow-up question if need be. All right, so a couple more questions about the bedding. So is there any advantage to having the newspaper in smaller pieces? You just like to rip it? Is there any better reason to?
There is. It's the same as when we're feeding them. It's the same mentality that smaller pieces of food and or bedding is easier for them to process. It decomposes naturally faster on its own. So you want, and it's also easier for them to move through it as they're going about their daily lives. And you don't have to be, I don't think that it needs to be something that is shredded. I know some people would only give their worms shredded paper or shredded newspaper. I don't think that's necessary in my personal experience, but nice like 1/2 inch, 1 inch strips off any sort of, old newspaper that you're using is great.
Okay. So after you do your harvesting, how do you set it up again? Do you use new bedding, or are you using just some of the castings with the worms along there? How do you get it going again?
So after you harvest, you will provide them a new round of bedding. So once you've gone through harvesting your worms and you have set aside your vermicompost and you have saved your worms and it's ready for them to go back in your bin, they're going to go back into a nice new bedding system that is most likely damp newspaper that's been torn up in 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch strips. And along with some of their vermicompost is fine. They don't need to go just completely by themselves. It's okay to put them in with some of their own vermicompost, but you are going to provide that bedding again and let them get through the bedding and then start feeding them the kitchen scraps and or your paper waste.
Okay. All right. Let's see, we're kind of going in lots of directions here. Okay, suggestions on storing the food so that it is available just once a week. What do you have? What do you suggest to keep that fresh enough for the worms?
Well, fresh enough is not something that you need to be concerned about. They actually like food that has already started decomposing. So I honestly just suggest one of those basic kitchen countertop compost collectors, those little cylinders that have a nice tight fitting lid, because that'll keep the fruit flies at bay and you won't be transferring fruit flies to your worm bin. And it's okay if it's kind of mucky and gross and slimy for your worms, because that's what they prefer, and that's what they're going to be waiting on in their worm bin anyway.
All right. So, and relating to that, it's okay to give them food that's a little bit moldy?
It's another it depends question. So I will give my worms a little bit of moldy food coming from vegetables and a little bit of slimy food coming from vegetables. I don't feed my bin breads or pastas because those type of molds are bad allergens for me personally. I'm a sensitive Sally and have every allergy you can possibly think of. So I avoid those types of molds. But if we're talking about just like kind of the muck that you see on top of a typical kitchen compost bin, that's fine to add to your worm bin.
Okay. Another it depends, huh? All right. Do you mix the food scraps into the bedding, or do you just put it up on top?
You need to mix the food scraps into the bedding. If you don't do that and you lay the food scraps just on top of the bedding and or maybe the vermicompost that you already have processing because you've had your worm bin for a couple months, that is an invitation for fruit flies. That's an invitation for our nosy neighbors that we don't necessarily want to come chuck out our worm bin. And they're not getting up and into it. So it's always nice to kind of dig a little hole in your worm bin and directly put the kitchen waste into that part of the worm bin and cover it up and let them come and kind of weave in and out of that. I happen to be a hands-on vermicomposter. I don't care about getting my hands into worm poop. So I lay the kitchen scraps on the top of my worm bin and I just work it in with my hands. I do have friends that wear gloves for that process. It doesn't creep me out. I just wash my hands afterwards. And I like to have my kitchen scraps all through my worm bin. But traditionally people will just move away like 1/4 of the worm bin or kind of separate maybe out the middle of the worm bin and put in the new food and cover it up.
All right. So you talked a little bit earlier about citrus. Do you you use it is there any part of the citrus that's okay rather than just the actual peels, or is there a reason to avoid it altogether?
The good rule of thumb is that worms just don't like an acidic environment. So the good rule of thumb is that if you have just used a little bit of citrus, let's say the example I used earlier, let's say you made some fish and you used a little bit of lemon, to top dress that fish, that can go in your worm bin. But if you've made a big pitcher of lemonade, that's too much citrus and that cannot go in your worm bin.
Okay. Another kind of it depends question, right? Okay, let's see. So one of our participants has had an issue with the harvested casting, that if they put it on top of the soil, it gets really hard, kind of a crust, I'm thinking. Is that common, or is there another way to deal with that?
Could I ask a clarifying question on that? So are you using your worm compost as maybe a mulch? Is that what you're talking about? Like you're just kind of dressing it around your plants or your potted plants, and then you're noticing it drying out and getting crusty? Is that what you're talking about?
All right. Let's see, Ray, that was your question. So if there's a follow-up you have for that. Let's see. Always takes a while to type for me, I know. All right. Okay. Now let's see. Let's go ahead and Ray, we'll come back to that one, and there's a couple other questions here. And if you have another follow-up for us, more information, you can go ahead and put that in the chat for us. Oh, there we go. Yes, top dressing. Got it.
Yeah, so top dressing, it will definitely dry out like any other mulch, even, you know, if you put compost on. It's okay when you're watering, it will go ahead and still break down, and the plants will get the benefit from it. But whenever you can, it's nice to go ahead and try to work it into the soil a little bit and treat it, you know, when you can, as a soil amendment, and try to mix it into the soil around the plants inside your garden or your pot, however you're working with your compost. But if, you know, your solution to using a lot of vermicompost is around your shrubs or your trees, and it's really more of a top dressing, it's okay that it dries out a little bit. And when it comes time to watering, it'll get the benefit from that through that process.
Okay. Let's see, you didn't talk too much about using coconut coir as far as a bedding. Is that something that's good, particularly when the bin is too wet, or are there other advantages to it as well?
It's just a different option for starting a bin. And a lot of times when you buy a commercial bin, one of those tiered systems, you'll get the tiers, and they will also inside you know, the thing that you've bought, whether it's one of the box ones or one of the wiggler systems, it'll come with a little block of coconut coir that you're meant to like break up and wet and then add your worms to it. It's just another bedding system. It's not necessarily you know, one's better than the other. I just think access to newspaper is all around us, and it's a great way to recycle newspaper.
Got it. All right. So we have a question about the stacking bins, because we haven't talked about that too much. So our participant wonders, should I be putting bedding in each layer as I empty a layer and put it on the top? I think that would be after harvesting and then moving it back up to the top.
So you don't want, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you don't want bedding in every single layer of a tiered system. So, because you're really often trying to get the worms to stay in one tier of that system. So typically worms want to go down. If they had eyes, they'd read the directions and they'd know that they're supposed to go down and be in the bottom layer. And they're supposed to be in the bottom layer of that tiered system. And when that's looking like they have processed most of the food that you've given them and you don't have any more room to work with in that tier, that's when you'll put that tier on the top, and then you'll start putting the new kitchen waste on the tier directly below that, and then they'll leave that vermicompost and go down where the food is, and then you'll be left with vermicompost that hopefully you only have to go through and sift out a few worms and just add that to the next layer. But you don't want bedding in every single layer of a tiered system, because you are trying to control that tiered system a little bit.
Okay, all right. So I have one other question here so far. So if there are any others, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. But this one's a little bit off the subject potentially. So there has been talk recently about a problem with jumping worms, which we haven't heard of. Is that anything we have in California here, or does it have anything at all to do with this kind of vermiculture thing?
I do not know of jumping worms, so I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. That's not something I am familiar with.
I don't know. Yeah, I've only heard a little bit about them. I thought they were a little bit more like a typical earthworm, so probably nothing that we would have in our vermiculture, but we could probably see what we can find out about that.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Okay. So I think we're back talking one more question now about the sort of the stacking style. How long does it take for the worms to migrate to the new bin when you're setting that next one up?
It depends on how big your tiers are, but typically you're shooting for a similar system as if you were using one of your home bins. I mean, a similar, excuse me, fill rate as you were using one of your home bins. Excuse me. And when that tier gets to about 3/4 of the way full, that would be the time that you're thinking about harvesting that tier and putting it at the top and putting the food at the new food at the bottom of that tier to get them to kind of migrate down and move to the new tier. And for most systems, it usually takes about 3 months for that to happen. Excuse me. Pardon.
A lot of talking you had to do here.
Yeah.
All right. Any comments on newspaper ink and its safety for the compost?
We just want to make sure that we're using basic newspapers because those come typically with non-toxic ink, but you do want to be mindful that if your newspapers have any shiny inserts or anything like that, that's when that paper might have a wax coating, and or it might have more toxic inks, you know, to get that shiny effect in those kind of glossy ads that we don't want to add to our worm bin, and that's better for the recycle bin and not the worm bin. So anything that's like shiny or glossy, we're going to avoid putting that in the worm bin.
Okay, I think most newspapers now use soy inks as far as I've heard. Yeah, that would be safe. All right, I don't have any other questions. So I think we've caught up on that part. And we've got, first off, we've got our, I don't know if I'm doing this part. Please, there you are.
I am going to reveal myself, and I want to ask folks some questions. First of all, I think this was an incredible class, really well delivered, beautiful information. I asked half the questions. Thank you so much, Bridget, for this. But we want to know what you think. That was what I think. So we're going to copy and paste into the chat this evaluation survey, and it's only like a 3-minute deal, really quick. So we'd really appreciate if you give us some feedback. And you can do that for us, Denise, copy and paste that link. We're also going to send this recording and the presentation to you guys by email, so you can live it over again. And if you forget what to do, you can reference it. You're going to receive in a month or two an email from the UC Master Gardener program in Sacramento, and they do this survey that is basically asking you, did you use the information that you learned in that class? And with that data, they apply for funding. So that's how we get paid. And we're an all volunteer program, but that's what keeps the Master Gardener program alive. So please answer that survey when it comes into your inbox. Now, here is the question of the hour. It's Mother's Day weekend on this weekend, and we have had posted on our calendar an in-person worm composting class on Saturday from 10 to 12 that Bridget here was gonna teach, and we have had absolutely no takers for that. I'm gonna launch a little quick poll, and I would like you guys to answer the question. I'm 99% at this point sure that we're gonna reschedule it because we think it's it's Mother's Day that is the problem. But the question is, would you come this Saturday? Would you come at a different time? Or is this not a thing you would want to do in person? Do you not want the worms? And Bridget, do you want to talk about what you would do and how it would be different than this?
So the point of the class is what we were trying to kind of set up is Wednesday night would be kind of, you know, like our in-class class, and Saturday would be our lab day. And I would definitely go over a little bit of vermiculture in the class, especially if someone wasn't in attendance tonight and came on Saturday. But the main purpose of the class would be for us all to build individual worm bins together, and for you to build your own worm bin in the class and then take it home. And it would take place in our gorgeous demo garden in Watsonville. That is one of our shining jewels of our program, and we love to show it off any chance that we get. And just walking through the demo garden is an amazing class in itself, because the people that take care of that garden do a beautiful job, and there's so much to learn just from the different demonstrations that we have in our demo garden of how to grow vegetables and flowers and fruits. And we've got great signage, and it's a great little thing to discover all by itself. And also within this class, I would ask you to bring whatever bin you wanted to turn into a worm bin. And I would try to supply enough drills and newspaper and worms and that, so we could build worm bins, and then you could take your worm bin home and go from there. And then of course have access to me with any questions or troubleshooting that you needed along the way. But no pressure, it's okay, we'll do it another time. But I think it would be a really nice opportunity for you to see the demo garden and also go home with a worm bin.
Okay, has everybody submitted their answer who is planning to do so? Here is the address of the demo garden in the chat.
Yep.
Nope, there we go.
Yes.
It's really the same address, it's just different parts of it.
Oh.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll and we will see the results.
Okay.
So what I'm seeing is that 2 people would go this Saturday. I think it's just a bad weekend, and a lot of you would come to a rescheduled version of it. Okay. So I think the decision, thank you, fair enough. Laura indicated, or I'm sorry to call you out, Laura, but some people are not comfortable getting together in person. That is still a thing. Right. So we knew that too. Right. But awesome. Thank you for helping us with that decision. But we'll stop sharing that. I do want to recommend that you guys all check out the Greywater Laundry to Landscape virtual presentation, and coming soon, June 11th, our 2022 garden tour. And we have a ridiculous number of gardens. I think we have something like 8 or 10 gardens. So I don't even know how you can get to all those gardens, but it's going to be really interesting. It's kind of in the middle of the county, in the Live Oak to Aptos range, and it's going to be wonderful and fairly inexpensive too. So look for that coming up, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Master Gardener event. Thank you all
so much, everyone, for coming tonight.
All right, take care, everybody, and happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day.
Thanks, Bridget.